Welcome to another in the series of Perth US Asia Center Foreign Policy Conversations. This one is delightful to be able to do in person. Much of the last year and a half has been these conversations via Zoom. And it's nice to actually sit in a real chair and have a conversation face to face. We're joined today by Air Commodore Fiona Dowse, who is the senior defense official here in Western Australia, is a member of the Order of Australia and received a Conspicuous Service Cross. I had to practice that sometimes because conspicuous is not one of those words that flows easily from the tongue. And for the last 2 years, you've served, again, as the senior defense official here and worked very closely with the Perth US Asia Center. So we thought it'd be nice to sit down and have a chat with you before we lose you and your good husband to Canberra. So thank you for making time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Gordon. It's great to be here.
As you know, the center has worked very closely with you and with the defense community in here, not just in the annual WA Indo-Pacific Defense Conference, which we're hoping to entice you back this October to join us again for that process, but also on a number of the issues that we look at that kind of impact on WA as a state, Australia as a nation in terms of security in the Indo-Pacific. I wanted to start off, obviously, given your Air Force background, to ask a little bit about the Air Force. I think given our Indian Ocean coastline, there's a lot of attention placed on the Navy. There's a heavy focus on HMAs Stirling, but not as much attention paid to the RAF, to the Royal Australian Air Force here in WA. Could you just give us a little bit of the background? I understand is it the 100th anniversary just recently of the Air Force? So
that's right.
Happy birthday,
yes.
and a chance to tell us a little bit about the RAF here in WA.
Certainly. Yes, it certainly is the 100th year of the Royal Australian Air Force, founded on the 31st of March in 1921. We are considered the younger child of the three services here in Australia. In March of that year, when they established the Royal Australian Air Force at Point Cook, there was actually more aeroplanes than there were people in the Air Force. Now, of course, it's very different. There's a lot more people than there are aeroplanes. But that just goes to demonstrate the difference in the capability and the capacities of the Air Force in the air environment now as to then. So when we started in 1921, it was not till 1928 that they decided that there needed to be a base built in Western Australia for the Royal Australian Air Force, and it came about in the next and following 10 years, and that was when we were established up at Pearce, which is now the main operating base in Western Australia for the Royal Australian Air Force. That contains a number of different squadrons and capabilities. There's 130 Squadron, the Singaporean Air Force Squadron there that does training for their pilots, but there's also 79 Squadron who does ab initio fighter pilot training, and 2 FTS, which is about making the pilots in the first place. We also have a significant number of assets at the Harold E. Holt establishment up at Exmouth, and they are more involved around surveillance and space, and they actually fill a part in giving that or mapping that greater strategic picture which is used by all elements of the Defence Force. So whilst you won't see a lot of numbers in terms of Air Force people in Western Australia, there still are some significant capabilities here in Western Australia. They're just not quite as obvious as maybe some of those big ships down at Stirling.
We do tend to look out to the ocean and not up as much as it happens. A year ago, this coming September, I realized that I had actually been earthbound for the longest period of time in over 30 years. It had been since 1986. I'd never been on the ground for more than 6 months at a time. And aching to fly, my wife and I flew to the Cocos Keeling Islands. And the route took us from Perth with a refueling stop in Exmouth, in Learmouth there before going over there. So it's one of the few bases in the world where you'll see military jets side by side with a commercial jet as it comes in to fly on there. So can you get a keen sense of how that sets. Let's talk about WA more broadly. Obviously, from a defense perspective, from a national security perspective, WA is big. You know, we're a third of the entire country in terms of land mass, the economic engine of Australia, given the resource sector, a lot of territory to defend, a lot of territory to cover. Can you just kind of give us a broader overview of the defence footprint in Western Australia?
Yes, certainly. Well, you certainly know a lot about the Navy because you do get to see them. That's a very substantial amount of the Navy's capacity down there at HMAS Stirling, and it certainly will look to grow as some of the new ships come online. As you also know, 13 Brigade now has a full-time commander in charge, and they're certainly looking to reposition themselves in terms of their capabilities and what they can actually project out into the region. And I think that the Air Force, as the space domain review comes to fruition and Space Division is set up early next year, you'll see some changes in regards to the footprint for the Air Force. So we do actually have for the Air Force bare bases at both Curtin Base, which is just outside Derby, Learmonth just outside of Exmouth. We have a number of training ranges or exercise ranges that are in the coastline for live fire from sea or use by the Special Forces. Of course, the brigade has 13 Brigade has a number of depots all over Western Australia. We have the Pilbara Regiment operating north of Geraldton. And of course, Stirling is a substantial naval asset, and the building going on down there is really, really mind-blowing. You've probably seen it a couple of times over your time here in Western Australia and noticed how the footprint there has certainly changed a great deal over the last 5 years.
There probably is a lack of awareness outside of Western Australia or even outside of Perth of how significant that presence is. The fact that Sydney also has a garden island makes it kind of complicated, but I don't think many people realize that in terms, depending on how you measure it, Fleet Base West, or HMAS Stirling, is actually the largest naval base in Australia, and as you pointed out, it's growing. Let's talk a little bit about that growth proposition. We at the Perth US Asia Center have branded everything we do Indo-Pacific. Yeah. There is a certain advantage to us sitting here in Australia's Indian Ocean capital that makes us want to make sure that Canberra and the rest of the country recognize the developments in our region. North in Singapore, Straits of Malacca, all the way up into Japan, and looking west towards India throughout the Indian Ocean. But that obviously has also been reflected in our national strategic documents. We were fortunate that when the Defence Strategic Update 2020 was launched, that the Defence Minister kindly agreed to come here to UWA for that launch. There's been several subsequent developments since then that have highlighted the turn of Australia towards the Indo-Pacific. And I would note that probably Defence led the way on this. The first time, if I'm correct, the term Indo-Pacific, it was used in an official government document, not just in Australia, but in the region, was the 2013 Defence White Paper. And in the subsequent 2016 Defence White Paper, then the 2020 Defence Strategic Update, it has kind of become the framing way we look at the region right now. So I wonder if you might talk a little bit about defence and the Indo-Pacific, and then tie WA's particular role back into that.
Right, yes. I think that was really the catalyst, that Defence Strategic Update that was given here in Western Australia last year really set the baseline for what Defence was looking to do post-Afghanistan. I think they had the focus that they needed on the Pacific, but they hadn't really exploited the focus on the Indian Ocean side of things. I think too much of that was about Western Australia and the attitude towards defence maybe in Western Australia. The present government decided early on that they were going to be more of a presence in that defence environment. The development of the defence industry strategy, the establishment of Defence West, I think indicated that the government was seriously looking to be involved in defence-based industries and support to defence as well. And I think that was a very good sign to defence that things were going to change. I do take your point that it's very often in Canberra hard to get people to talk about Western Australia. It sometimes seems to me that the interest ends at the South Australian border. I think sometimes Western Australia encourages this. We are very parochial, and we do sometimes like to see ourselves as being very independent because we do generate so much of Australia's wealth from this particular state. But I think there has been this realisation that expansion into sovereign capabilities is something that really fits what's happening in Western Australia. I don't think we can get across to Canberra often enough to explain the virtues of the geographical situation that Western Australia has. From a surveillance point of view, we have a lot of airspace that's uncontrolled. We have low levels of light in a lot of the state, and we have the largest amounts of uninhabited land. And those three things certainly suit defence in the way that they operate. And I think that the more we talk about those types of things, the more we can interest Canberra in it, because they can see the opportunity, and they've got, can I say, a great group of strategic thinkers in this state that have got the Indo part of the Indo-Pacific strategy really well thought out. They've got fantastic connections in the Indian Ocean rim. And I think that by exploiting a number of those things together, we will see the opportunity for Western Australia become more apparent. One other thing that I think is sometimes a little difficult to explain to Canberra is the work tempo and attitude here. When mining companies in Western Australia find themselves with a problem, they quickly find a start-up or an in-house solution to rectify that problem. They don't wait around expecting someone to come and invent it for them. If it's not there, they will do it themselves. That keeps the process going. That type of thinking applied to a defence issue is exactly what I think is needed in the future.
Interesting. In the broader public, when people think defense, they think warfighting.
Yes.
When the reality is, there's was it Napoleon said that the army travels on its stomach or something to that effect. The logistics and it's something that you know more than most about is actually the lion's share of the activity, in terms of that process. And when it comes to a state economy like Western Australia, the resource sector really is about logistics. It's about the technologies associated with that, the innovations that you just rightly pointed to. And so my presumption has long been that there is significant implications for and potential for the defense industry and the defense sector more broadly that can be drawn from or learned from our resources sector, precisely because of that pace that you're talking about. So interesting. Another comment I'll add is a bit of a confession, is that 10, 15 years ago, when I first began to hear the term Indo-Pacific, I was in Washington, D.C., and I was a bit skeptical because, I had originally began to work on the East Asia or Northeast Asia, and it really wasn't until the middle of my career that this phrase Asia-Pacific became quite popular. And it really became popular in the late 80s, early 90s because the Australians and the Kiwis decided that they wanted to be part of Asia, and at the same time, Japan and Korea recognized that they wanted to integrate it southwards, and so we began to have the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Initiative and the Pacific Basin Economic Cooperation Initiative, and Asia-Pacific became de rigueur. Once you began to tack in the Indian Ocean, which I paid no attention to, from Washington, D.C., it seemed to me that Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean, it's 2/3 of the world. You might as well be global. It doesn't have any use in helping frame thinking at a policy level. But where you stand depends on where you sit. And 8 years in WA, and you mentioned the leadership that we have here. When I assumed my position almost 8 years ago, Kim Beazley, our governor, was then ambassador in Washington, D.C. Stephen Smith, who had been defense minister when that 2013 defense white paper came out, was here. We had David Johnson, who led the 2016 defense white paper, again using the term Indo-Pacific. Then our foreign minister, Julie Bishop, who led the 2017 foreign policy white paper, again using Indo-Pacific as a framing contract. all kind of drove that level of thinking. And then we were fortunate to have after that Linda Reynolds also from WA. So clearly defense and WA political leaders have had a very important role of shaping how I see the Indo-Pacific, and I think how the region sees the Indo-Pacific as well. Let's go back a little bit to the Air Force, if we might. Given what we've just been talking about in terms of shifts in the Indo-Pacific, you mentioned early on the fact that Singapore, has a training presence here. Clearly, we have something that they don't have, which is land. But my presumption is that Singapore is not unique in that. We've got a lot of land and some very important partners in the region. Can you tell me about what you see as the potential for Air Force future in WA? Where do you think the Air Force is likely to go in terms of its WA presence?
I think Singapore actually is probably key to a lot of our future international engagement. And the way that I see Singapore is they have got incredible partnerships up through Asia, through the Indian Ocean countries as well. Great negotiators, great friends, and excuse me, they certainly understand the need for coalition and to work together. If you are in a fighter jet in Singapore and you take off, you're out of Singapore airspace in 3 minutes. So
wow.
they value space. It's what we have in Australia and has actually formed the cornerstone of much of our relationship with Singapore. Singapore has moved, or did move last year, their air grading centre from Tamworth to Jandakot. As I said before, they have 130 Squadron operating up at Pearce, and that has been a long ongoing arrangement. So they have force generating a lot of their pilots right here in Australia. They also, of course, have set up a large training area in conjunction with the Australian Defence Force up in Queensland, which over the next few years will develop significantly as a facility for both of us to use. They are always a participant in our air exercises, particularly Pitch Black, which is probably the regional star exercise. It's a multilateral exercise, but Singapore comes in early and does a couple of training schedules before it and after it. And everyone looks forward to seeing Singapore down. Truly competent, very good partner, and they are extremely grateful for whatever assistance we might give them. But that boils down to what's in it for the Air Force in the future. Much of what Air Force is going to be doing in the future, nobody's actually going to be able to see. So in that sense, I'm talking about a lot of the surveillance assets, a lot of the work that will happen in space. I mean, everyone uses the benefits or the results of all of that work for surveillance in space, every day with GPS and other things like that, but you don't actually see it coming from anywhere. There's no pipeline or anything. So the way Air Force is actually going to develop in Western Australia, I don't think you're going to see a massive movement of squadrons of aircraft, but I don't think necessarily that future engagements are going to be dependent upon massings of people at any one point. I think it's going to be how you deliver your capabilities, how fast you deliver your capabilities, how fast you resupply them, logistics comes into it again, and how you can sustain that effort over a long period of time. And it boils down to your qualitative edge. You can have as much equipment as you can buy, but unless your guys know how to use it, they're well trained in it, and you are capable of resupplying it, it's not going to be useful at all. So I suppose that's a bit of a mismatch to answer your question, but I think whatever we do, we're going to do in coalition, and that's something that I see Western Australia being able to enhance through their political and strategic contacts, because I would say all of you guys that work in that strategic space have wonderful connections into the Indian Pacific region. I think that the Defence Force, they build international engagement relationships with other countries in the region, and we work very hard at that. That's going to form another element to it. But I think as we go into space, starting next year with the new space division, and we get more into that surveillance piece, I think that's where Air Force is going to actually grow bigger.
That makes a lot of sense. I presume whether it's an Air Force or defense more broadly, there's got to be a special office that just comes up with cool names for military exercises.
There is actually.
Talisman, Saber, Pitch Black. It just sounds so cool to work at.
Actually, there is. There's a place in Joint Operations Command. I think they work it out.
They're really good. Well, look, I want to take it and wrap this up by turning a little bit to the personal. Number one, I understand you're from Kula, which is south of here. There's had to have been some big changes in the course of your career in the military. And I'd welcome kind of your reflections on looking at it from your origins to where you are right now at the end of this part of your career. And then secondly, I understand that you spent some time as the first ever female exchange officer to the U.S. Air Mobility
Command,
Air Mobility Air Command. You can tell me exactly what it was. And you received a U.S. Meritorious Service Award for that time there. Given those experiences, I wonder if you might want to reflect a little bit about your role kind of as a pioneer on these certain roles in the military as a woman. As somebody who came from Kula, there can't be too many Air Commodores in Kula, from Kula in that process. And welcome your kind of personal reflections.
Thanks, Gordon. There is no other Air Commodore in Coolum, I can tell you that. I was only down there a couple of months ago for an Anzac Day service, so I do happen to know that. When I first joined the Air Force in 1976, that's a terribly long time ago, but it really was something that was going to be an interim, short-term fun thing to do. A girlfriend of mine convinced me it'd be a wonderful idea, and so we went off and did it and thought, oh, well, we'll just have a fun time, not a long time. But once you become part of the organisation and you see the opportunities, and they do give you a great deal of education and training, it's often difficult to leave because the next thing coming up is something that you really wanted to do. It certainly has changed in terms of opportunities for women. When I joined, I think we got to learn how to operate a floor polisher at Rookies, where the guys got weapons, but we got a floor polisher. Women didn't do things like security at buildings because it was far too dangerous. We got to make tea. But I early on decided what I thought looked like a good job and an interesting job, and so started in a couple of areas where they hadn't had women before. Particularly air movements, which now, of course, is well populated by women, but in those days they didn't have them. It was always hard to be a trailblazer in those things, but a bit of tenacity and a bit of resilience will normally get you through, as it did. And from there on in, it was just a continuing opportunity after opportunity that you couldn't say no to. So I look back now and see what I was not allowed to do and what women are doing now. I actually read a very interesting article on a couple of girls that are serving in infantry right now and how they actually operate as women within infantry units, which are, of course, predominantly men, but also the physical aspects of being a woman in such of those units, which was always the argument for not having women in certain positions was that they physically weren't capable of doing it, or there was some parameter that would have to be changed. Nowadays, Gordon, if you can pass the prereqs for that particular occupation, then you can do it. And gender is not a question they ask you. It's about, capacity to do the job. So you can be anything you like now, but it's been a journey, I would say, to get to that point to enable that to happen. Look, I often tell people who ask me, would you say, let your daughter join the Defence Force? I'd say yes. There's very few true equal opportunity employers. They can choose whatever job they want. They can have whatever training they need, and they can go on to be anything that they want to be. There will be no restraints on them based on gender. And there's a lot of organisations now that can't say that, and I think that's where Defence has actually moved it along a bit. I will say about serving in the United States, it was very, very interesting. I was at the Tanker Airlift Control Centre, which at that time looked after all of the air mobile assets, plus all their tankers. At that time, the USAF was the biggest airline in the world because they used to add in their organic aircraft to their civil reserve air fleet, which we know Evergreen and all the other aircraft that fly with the USAF to support them. They were even bigger than Aeroflot at that time, which was quite massive. So it was a huge, huge organisation and operating 24/7 all over the world. Absolutely fabulous. This was a country and an Air Force that was so big, and I came from one that at that time was, had 24 C-130s. They have 24 and half a squadron.
It did put the logistics in context, didn't it?
The size was just beyond belief, and the professionalism, wonderful. Learned a great deal there in a short amount of time. Certainly know their business.
Well, look, we have benefited tremendously from having you here in Western Australia serving as senior defence official. And I would note we've also benefited from having your husband, former Vice Air Marshal Andrew Dowse up at ECU, with whom we've worked very closely with. I might end by noting that back in 2014, there was the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium here. And the then commander of the U.S. Pacific Command, before they changed the name to Indo-Pacific Command, Harry Harris, came down here. And I actually, as it happened, had known Harry for years because his wife, former Navy Commander Bruni Bradley, had been a Mansfield Fellow, and I used to run the Mansfield Foundation. And so I met Harry over and over again, but I just knew him as Bruni's husband. And so when I introduced him in this venue, I made sure that I introduced him appropriately as Bruni Bradley's husband. So I will note today that, again, we appreciate your service. We appreciate your insights today. And we're going to miss both you and Andrew as he goes back to Canberra. But as he departs, we will bid farewell to Air Commodore Fiona Dowse's husband, Andrew, as well. So,
thank you, Gordon.
Thank you. Appreciate it.